there, and welcome to another A Healthy New Zealand podcast. And today it gives me great pleasure to talk to the very inspiring and humble Dr. James Muecke. Dr. Muecke is an ophthalmologist, I hope I said that properly, who was awarded Australian of the Year in 2020 as recognition for his work fighting blindness in the most vulnerable populations through Australia, Asia and Africa. And he decided to use this powerful platform over the last year to educate about the dangers of type 2 diabetes. He really wants people to understand that this is a reversible lifestyle disease and it's not a life sentence. He's also been advocating for change in the Australian dietary guidelines, and I believe these are now coming up for review. And that's really good news for us in New Zealand because our guidelines are influenced by what's going on in Australia. So welcome, Dr. Muecke. Thanks for being here today, despite all our technology issues we've been having.
Thank you, Susan. Lovely to be with you today.
I was wondering if you would start by telling us what an ophthalmologist does and your work with Sight for All, and then we can maybe move into the diabetes topics.
Sure. So it gets a bit confusing, doesn't it, with optometrists, orthoptists, opticians, ophthalmologists. But basically, an ophthalmologist is a medically trained eye specialist. So I often refer to myself just simply as an eye surgeon. So it's often easier for people to comprehend. So I undertook a 6-year medical degree, had to do several years of general medical training, and then a 4-year ophthalmology training program. So it's quite an intensive training program or just commitment from your life to actually ultimately become an eye specialist. So it's been something that I've really committed at least 30 years of to this stage in my life. But something that I always had a passion for was helping in poorer communities in the world. In fact, in my 5th year medical school, I went to work as a general doctor not as a general doctor, as a medical student during my medical elective in Kenya. And I came across a little hospital in the mountains in central Kenya, in the foothills of what's called the Aberdare Mountains. Fell in love with this place and thought that one day I'd like to come back and work in Kenya as a general doctor. So through my intern year, this was starting to come to me as a really good thing to do, because I was starting to become a bit jaded with all of those years of study through high school, through medical school. An internship was full on, and it was, we had these killer 34-hour shifts back then, sometimes every 3rd day, which was pretty overwhelming and exhausting. And I think the other thing to me that struck me was this was my first year of practicing real medicine, and I was mainly just seeing patients who had chronic diseases or often self-inflicted. And back then, in the 80s, in the mid-80s, it was really patients who had diseases that were caused by smoking, particularly, but also we were starting to see dietary diseases back then. And really, all you could really do was alleviate symptoms and prolong life, and that didn't kind of sit well with my personality. I'm the sort of guy that loves to have a project and to complete a project to get results. And so it just didn't appeal to me. And so I just wanted to have a change from the medicine that I was being exposed to. And I remembered my time in Kenya as a medical student and thought, wouldn't it be nice to go back and do that? So I rode away to the hospital in Kenya and was offered a job there. And so I headed off there as soon as I'd finished my internship to work, as I say, as a general volunteer doctor, actually. And I saved, in fact, through my entire internship, which was my first year of earning money, so that I could do that. And that really was a special year. And we could talk for an hour just about that, but it reinvigorated a love for medicine for me, because now I was dealing with patients who had diseases that were predominantly not self-inflicted. So they were often infectious diseases such as malaria and TB. And I loved the fact that I could, cure people, that I could make a difference. And that was really a special thing to experience. And also at that time, I started to get a desire to pursue a career in public health in poorer parts of the world. And I'd always, through my life, wanted to do medicine in order to become a surgeon, and I loved using my hands to do fine work. So the idea of microsurgery was particularly appealing. And so when the opportunity came back to return to Australia to train in ophthalmology, I really took that by the horns, because the idea of curing blindness, particularly cataract blindness, which is the leading cause of blindness in the world, and doing that in poorer communities, is something that really appealed. So I headed home back to Australia and undertook my ophthalmology training in Adelaide. And then after that, I headed to the Middle East to work in Jerusalem at St. John's Eye Hospital, which was another transformative year for me. Both my time in Africa and in Jerusalem, they were very confronting and fascinating experiences, but ultimately it cemented a passion for fighting blindness in poorer parts of the world. And I actually went on then to London to study eye cancer, and then came back and settled in Adelaide in 1998, where I've really been ever since. But through those early years of being back in Adelaide, to keep that connection with working in poorer communities and fighting blindness, I started becoming involved in a number of research and educational projects throughout Asia. And why Asia? Because, well, it's close to home, of course, but it's also home to half the world's blind adults and 2/3 of the world's blind kids. So those projects are what ultimately developed into Sight for All, which I co-founded back in 2007. And I suppose the key strategy of Sight for All's work is training and equipping colleagues so that they can comprehensively and sustainably fight all the blinding diseases that they come across in their countries. So we've trained in all of the subspecialty areas of my profession, and we're ultimately impacting on about 1 million people every year in Asia. And as you mentioned, we've also had some projects in Africa, and we also have a responsibility of what's going on here in Australia. So in Aboriginal communities, we have significant problems with blindness, and also in mainstream communities, with diabetes being the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults. And simply an awareness raising is critical here in Australia. If we look at the situation in poorer countries, often patients don't have access to healthcare, and particularly eye healthcare, or they can't afford it. Whereas here we have access, even in the most remote communities and Aboriginal communities, the patients have access to ophthalmologists and optometrists, and healthcare is free, but it's often that awareness factor that's missing. So what we've been doing here in Australia really has been about raising awareness.
Well, all I can say is you're a bit of an underachiever, aren't you?
Yeah, it's a bit of a problem I have.
As I was listening to you, I was wondering, did you have your family with you while you were off on all these forays around the world, or did that come later?
Certainly in Kenya, and I also associated with that time in Kenya, I backpacked for close to a year around Africa, and I had some incredibly confronting and life-threatening experiences. I was actually captured by rebel soldiers in Uganda. This is back in 1989, so my internship was 88. I crossed Mozambique through an active civil war zone on an armed convoy. I contracted malaria twice, amoebic dysentery once. My house where I was living at the hospital in Kenya was robbed 5 times. So, I had some pretty confronting experiences equally in Jerusalem, but certainly those early years in Africa, I was by myself, made lots of friends along the way, of course. And when I went to Jerusalem, my wife came with me, Mina. We'd been married for a couple of years, and we had an absolutely fabulous experience together there as being young newlyweds. I worked at the eye hospital and on the Arabic side, and my wife worked as an interior architect on the Israeli side initially. And her bus actually got bombed just after she got off it. And so she ended up retiring or resigning from that job and coming to work on the Palestinian side. And she was involved in restoring one of the biblical churches in the old city of Jerusalem. So, she had an extraordinary experience. I had this amazing experience. And together we just had this beautiful time in our early years of our marriage. And so more recently, with the work I've been doing in Asia, and particularly with Sight for All, I now have 2 boys, actually. One has recently left home at the age of 24, and the other one's just finished second year medical school at the age of 21. And but quite often through those years, as Sight for All was growing and I was getting involved in some projects, quite often my wife Mina would come along with me, and also I'd bring the boys as well. And both have been involved in projects So both have been involved in childhood blindness studies that we've undertaken in Asia. And my eldest son, who's actually a filmmaker, has been involved in doing some documentaries with me. And in fact, we were in Myanmar last year finishing off a documentary about an extraordinary colleague that we've trained there. So the family has been very much a part of this journey with me, which has also been fabulous. I'm not, I don't leave the home for weeks on end. In fact, I probably only spend 2 to 3 weeks away a year, and if I can bring the family with me, even better. So it's certainly one of those experiences that we're all just enjoying and enhancing our life.
And it sounds really grounding and like really keeps your perspective and reality on life and the world as well, I imagine.
Well, it does. And, people often ask me, how did I head down that humanitarian pathway? And so I think if you're going to head down this pathway, if you're going to set up a not-for-profit, and particularly if you want to do it so in poorer parts of the world, I think having that spirit of adventure is really critical. And you can just imagine my spirit of adventure is very high from some of the experiences I just explained to you. But the humanitarian spirit comes from really powerful experiences that you may have during those times. And again, I could mention a number of them to you, but perhaps the single most powerful experience that I had back in 2007, I was running a childhood blindness study in Myanmar in Southeast Asia. And the idea was to determine the causes of blindness in children in schools for the blind throughout the country. And what we found was actually quite staggering. We found that nearly half of the kids had blindness that could have been prevented or treated. So half were needlessly blind and shouldn't even be at those schools. So that alone was pretty confronting. But the thing which was really powerful and actually had quite a deep impact on myself and the whole team that was involved in the project was the leading cause of blindness that we found, that was measles. And so I imagine most people wouldn't have any idea that measles could cause blindness. And to be in a school for the blind, or to be in multiple schools for the blind throughout a country, and to be surrounded by children who are horribly disfigured, irreversibly blind, and blinded in the most horrendous and painful way, it is life-changing. And from that experience, I felt strongly passionate, a huge desire to want to make a difference, want to do something about this. And that ultimately I went back to Myanmar with the published study and met with the health minister, and I said, we've got a problem here. We really need to train a children's eye specialist for the country. So this was such a formative experience for me. And it was also really what was the driving force to set up Sight for All. And we brought this young eye specialist out to Australia. He trained at the Windsor Children's Hospital in Adelaide through 2010 as the very first pediatric ophthalmologist for his country. So he went back home at the end of his hands-on year of training, and we set him up in the country's first children's eye unit, where he works to this day. So, over 10 years later, he's now providing close to 30,000 treatments to children every single year. More impressively, he is actually training his own colleagues now using the expertise he gained here in Australia. And in 2015, finished training a second pediatric ophthalmologist for the country. And he now trains at least 2 a year. So that really just captures the 3 key strategies of Sight for All, being research, education, and supporting equipment and infrastructure, and also shows you the sustainability and the scalability of the work that we do. So we've trained pediatric ophthalmologists now throughout Asia, and we've also trained colleagues in all of the subspecialty areas of our profession, all 9 of the subspecialty areas. So it's been a labour of love, an all-consuming passion for quite some years, and but it's been one of the greatest things of my life.
And just so valuable. I was going to ask you about why, so many Southeast Asians suffer from blindness. So is measles one of the main causes, or are there other contributing factors as well?
So childhood blindness and adult blindness are almost, you can consider them as separate entities, as separate subspecialties or separate professions anyway. So in children, it depends on the poverty level of a country. So some of the poorest countries, things like vitamin A deficiency and measles are high on the list. So as they were in Myanmar, we also undertook childhood blindness studies in Laos in 2013, Cambodia 2008. And once again, we found that measles was a significant cause of blindness in each of those countries. But when we get into countries such as Australia, so childhood blindness is mainly inherited diseases, genetic diseases, those avoidable causes of blindness in kids, such as measles and vitamin A deficiency, we just don't see. In adults, worldwide, the leading cause of blindness is cataract. And the majority of blindness occurs in poorer countries. So something like 90% of blindness occurs in poorer countries. So cataract is by far the biggest problem. And that is because there's not often the eye specialists to be able to do the surgery, particularly out in regional areas. And even when there are eye specialists, they may not have the equipment, the tools to be able to do the surgery. And even if they have all of those things, there may not be patients that can afford to pay for the surgery. So for all these reasons, cataract and more, there's a fear as well. These reasons, cataract blindness is the leading cause of blindness in poorer parts of the world. Also the leading cause of blindness in Aboriginal people here in Australia, and I suspect also in the Maori population in New Zealand.
And are cataracts preventable, or are they sort of an age-related problem, or is there a combination of factors there?
Yeah, the majority of cataract blindness is due to what we call senile cataract, which is simply aging change in the lens inside the eye. I'm getting closer to. So it's a bit of a cruel word, but it's called senile cataract, and virtually everyone who lives long enough will develop a cataract. It's not preventable, but it is readily treatable. These days, it's a 15-minute operation, give or take, and highly successful. It's a fabulously thrilling operation to be involved in, which I was involved in surgery for many, many years until I had to give up in 2013. So not preventable, but treatable. But interestingly, I was also involved in an adult blindness study in Myanmar in 2005, where we found, and I was in my early 40s at the time, we found there were people who were younger than me, around about the age of 40, who were blind from cataracts. And that's something we certainly don't see here. So I wondered whether there were other potentially preventable elements, whether it be dehydration or whether it be some nutritional element that may have contributed to seeing cataracts in younger people. But that's something we are exploring, and hopefully we'll have the answer one day. So at this point in time, I'd say it's avoidable in that it's treatable, but it's not preventable.
I'll talk to Dr. Chris Kenobi. Are you aware of him? He's an eye surgeon from the States, who is setting up a non-profit for age-related macular degeneration. And he talks quite a lot about the role of processed foods, and he has a belief that, the seed oils play quite a big role in that process, which is maybe something we can talk about shortly when we get into our...
Yes, in fact, Chris and I have been emailing over the last few months, but I actually had an email from him this morning. We're going to have a Zoom meeting next week.
Oh, nice. Excellent.
Yeah, so we've been in touch and we've been wanting to speak for some months, and we're looking forward to chatting more with him, because I think he's spot on there, because macular degeneration, or what we call age-related macular degeneration, is the leading cause of blindness in say, high-income countries. Certainly countries such as Australia and New Zealand, it's the leading cause of blindness in adults, and overall the leading cause of blindness. And it is treatable. Again, it's not preventable. There are genetic elements to it, but there's probably also some environmental elements. And Chris's hypothesis is that ultra-processed foods, and potentially the seed oils in those foods, are driving this. And so I suspect there is some truth in what he is studying, and with time this will come out. I think that evidence is certainly mounting against ultra-processed foods and the myriad of dangers that they're causing to the human body.
Interesting. So just one more question about, the children and blindness and the measles. Is there a vaccination program or anything, or is this the problem, or...
Yeah, this is the problem. So it costs less than $1 to prevent measles in a child through a vaccination program. And I would challenge any anti-vaxxer to go and spend a day in a school for the blind in a poor country and be surrounded by kids who are blind from measles. It's a life-changing experience. In Myanmar, one of the things I did when we published the results of that study was also to go and meet with UNICEF, who at the time were running the measles vaccination program. And they simply, there was, I think, a lot of paranoia at the time from the Myanmar government that the vaccination was causing other issues. And so they had really wound the vaccination program down, but I was able to show them that actually we need to wind the vaccination program up and get it out to more remote and regional parts of the country where they didn't have the reach that they needed. And so that's been transformative as well. We went back in 2018, did a follow-up childhood blindness study, and we found that the level of avoidable blindness is already starting to drop in the kids there. So I think we're having a dual effect in that really powerful study. Just that one study was able to allow the measles vaccination program to ramp up, but also the training of the children's eye specialists, which is now self-sufficient, essentially. They're now continuing to do that and fight childhood blindness in their country without ongoing outside help. So we'll see over the next few years and decades this steady reduction in childhood blindness due to avoidable causes at least, and we'll start to see, as we do here in Australia, the rise of genetic causes.
Wow, what an amazing story, and what, an incredible contribution. I just think that's just so fascinating. I could listen to you talk about that for an hour, as you said, but we should probably get on to talking a little bit about diabetes, I suppose. So why would an ophthalmologist care about diabetes?
Sure. So being, I mentioned I trained in eye cancer in London back in 1997, 98. But eye cancer is very rare, so I'm still a general ophthalmologist. I still treat a whole range of eye diseases, including age-related macular degeneration. But the one that I've noted that has been rising over the past 30 years of being an eye surgeon is eye disease, loss of vision, even blindness due to diabetes, but particularly type 2 diabetes, which makes up about 90% of cases. So every year, seeing more and more patients who are really getting struck down by this. And I was lucky enough to be nominated for South Australian of the Year in late 2019. And when I made my acceptance speech, I said, I wanted to raise awareness of the fact that diabetes is the leading cause of blindness amongst working age adults. And why was that? Well, we have about 1.7 million people with diabetes in this country, and well over half are not having their regular eye checks. And so these eye checks are actually crucial in avoiding blindness and loss of vision due to diabetes. So, I was jumping up and down saying, we need to raise awareness of this critical fact and encourage people to come in and have their eye checks from their optometrist or their ophthalmologist. And then, lo and behold, I won the award, and going forward to the national award, which was in January. In fact, the Australia Day weekend's coming up this weekend. So I'm in my last week of my role. But I thought if I do win the national award, I wasn't expecting to at all, because the year before it was a doctor from Adelaide, and I didn't think they would give it to two doctors from Adelaide in a row. But I was very fortunate to receive that incredible accolade. And I thought, well, now that I have this really important recognition and this powerful platform, that I want to do something really profound with it. And when I look at the leading cause of diabetes being type 2 diabetes, the fact that there are probably close to 1.5 to 1.7 million people with type 2 diabetes in this country, and the root cause is our poor diet, a diet which is high in sugar, refined carbohydrates, seed oils, and many of those components make up the ultra-processed foods that you mentioned. It's really time to think about this seriously, and that's what I've been doing for the last year. I've been jumping up and down, lobbying the government, being a serial pest on social media, and really trying to raise awareness of a number of elements which we can continue to talk about. But that's why I got involved. I just thought, this should not happen. Type 2 diabetes was virtually non-existent back in the 60s. And now we're seeing about 250 new cases in Australia every single day of type 2 diabetes. This is a disease that used to be called maturity onset diabetes. We're now seeing it in children in Australia, children as young as 7. There's actually a famous case from the UK of type 2 diabetes in a 3-year-old child that was fed a diet that was high in sugary drinks. And it's also impacting on our Indigenous population, our Aboriginal population. There's been something like an 80-fold to 100-fold increase in type 2 over the past 40 years. So it's devastating these poor underprivileged people. And talking about underprivileged people, we are seeing type 2 diabetes to be more prevalent in lower socioeconomic areas of the country. So Greater Western Sydney, for example, there's 50% of the adult population over the age of 24 have either pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So that is quite staggering. And so, if we look at what's driving this, which is our poor diet, our poor diet is actually responsible for more disease and death than inactivity, alcohol and smoking combined. So this is why I felt so passionate that I wanted to do something about it. And you'll probably sense that my whole approach has gone full circle from my internship, where I was feeling disillusioned, let's say, from seeing patients with preventable diseases who are just should not be, to having this desire to want a quick, easy fix through cataract surgery, and then coming back full circle. And that was really driven by the experiences I had in Asia, seeing children who are irreversibly blind from a preventable disease, as in measles. We also, in those schools with blind, we saw children who were visually impaired and blind because they'd never been tested for spectacles, another highly preventable approach. So I came full circle, and I see how critical prevention is in medicine, and that's why I have taken this mighty challenge on.
And I really appreciate the size of the challenge, and am so grateful that we have people like you, working in this area, helping to give voice to people like me, because you have a much better platform and you can communicate better with the medical profession, and you'll be taken seriously, whereas it's a lot harder for people like myself to be really taken seriously. But I know
what you're doing, Susan, as well, and I think the more voices we can have in this space, the better, because when we have a man-made avoidable dietary disease that is blinding people, maiming people, killing people, destroying lives and families, it just is heartbreaking.
I know. I can relate to what you were saying quite a bit about the disillusionment with being a doctor, because that was one of the things about medicine that didn't appeal to me. And I really love nutritional biochemistry, because by understanding what these foods do inside our body, and then you feel like you've actually got some power to take control of your health back. But the difficulty is communicating that to the average person who is choosing what to eat meal by meal, without them really understanding the implications of how every time they eat, they are affecting their health, their mood, their hormones, their brain, their eyes. Like every component of their well-being is being affected by what they're putting in their mouth.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, to me, awareness is one of the critical issues here. I think there are three overarching issues, one being awareness, one being accountability, and one being action. And we can go through those. But just looking at awareness, simply awareness amongst the Australian public that sugar is a toxin when it's consumed excessively and over a prolonged period of time. Awareness that the refined carbohydrates, so products made from white flour, white rice, white potatoes, their starch, which are in essence sugar in disguise, and then also the fact that the ultra-processed foods that we're consuming by the bucket load are full of sugar and refined carbohydrates, and as you mentioned before, the seed oils, the vegetable oils, all of these three components have a role to play in type 2 diabetes. I have no doubt in the complications of type 2 diabetes. So if people are not aware, then that's a problem, and I suspect many people are not aware. People might inherently know that maybe if you have too much sugar, it's not good for you, but I don't think they realize how the mechanism works and quite how dangerous it is. And then also people who ultimately develop pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, are they truly aware of what lays ahead of them if they don't reverse their type 2 diabetes. We know now that it is a reversible disease. We can put it into remission. It's a preventable disease, and it's also a reversible disease. Many patients, I suspect, would have no idea, and these horrendous complications, which we talked about a moment ago. But also, I suspect there are many GPs out there who are not aware that this is a potentially reversible disease. So awareness is really critical here. And there's also, I came up with a concept a year ago, as leading up to the Australia Day ceremony. I was trying to get my head around it because it's quite a complex space, isn't it? It's quite a...
It is.
It's quite a complex space. So I came up with this concept called the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. So just very briefly, the first A is addiction. So sugar is highly addictive, shown to be as addictive as nicotine. And for anyone who's actually tried to detox from sugar, it's actually pretty unpleasant. Second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress. When we consume sugar, it triggers the release of feel-good chemicals such as dopamine, which we need to counter the stress hormone cortisol, which is flooding our body during anxious times. Third A is accessibility. Sugar is cheap and absolutely everywhere in our lives. You can't walk into a service station these days without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. You can't check out from most supermarkets and stores without being enticed by half-price soft drinks and chocolate. So, you know, this is the environment is just flooded absolutely with sugary products. Fourth A is addition. You know, something like 75% of our food and drinks have added sugar, and the ultra-processed foods are one of the huge culprits here. And the final A is advertising. So again, we are bombarded by ads, TV commercials, almost everywhere you look. And once you're aware of that, once you're aware that sugar is addictive, we use it to alleviate stress, how much sugar is in our food and drinks, and the lure of an environment which is full of sugary products and ads for those sugary products, you can then start to put in place mechanisms to reverse the draw, the very powerful draw of those products, which industry know all too well.
Well, and the problem is getting anyone to take notice, you know, and I think it's great you've got the Australian government to actually look at the guidelines. But then, you know, I mean, you and I could talk for hours about what will that entail, and will they look at them in a different way, and you know, what kind of, you know, boundaries and what kind of research, the methodology they will use. So there's a lot of questions about that, but at least they've agreed to look at them. But getting anyone to take notice, because the lobbyists and the big food, and, you know, there's so many vested interests in this, that over here, you know, plant-based diets are just advocated everywhere, and people don't realize we're already eating a plant-based diet. You know, more than 60% of our food comes from processed foods, and about 12% from fruits and vegetables and, you know, other carbohydrates. You can't get much more plant-based than that. You know?
Yeah, but in fact, I looked at the, I don't know if you've seen our Australian Guide for Healthy Eating, which is sort of a graphic depiction of our Australian dietary guidelines. And I added up all of the plant-based foods that were or the images at least, and added up all the animal source foods. And it was 80% plant-based versus 20% animal-based. And so, you know, that really reflects a bias and a significant bias in creating those guidelines. And as you mentioned, in our guidelines, which are based on the American guidelines, and the New Zealand guidelines are probably based on our guidelines, and the guidelines essentially reflect a high carbohydrate dietary approach. So it's 45 to 65% carbs recommended by our dietary guidelines, which is an average of 55. But in fact, it's probably the way they portray it on the graphics is it's closer to 80%, I suspect, or at least 2/3. And so a high carb dietary approach, which we've adopted for the past 40 years. So the encouragement in the guidelines to eat grains and cereals, the encouragement in the guidelines to eat polyunsaturated oils, you know, the vegetable oils, the seed oils. This is really problematic, and the discouragement of the eating of natural saturated fats, not only in products such as, you know, salmon, avocado, olive oil, but also in eggs, full fat dairy, unprocessed red meat, even dark chocolate. You know, there's no solid scientific evidence to say that these products are linked to cardiovascular disease, and yet they've been demonized for the last 40 to 50 years. And this is what needs to be reversed in our guidelines. We need to change our guidelines from a high carbohydrate approach to certainly a lower carbohydrate approach. You know, if we look at the fact that 2/3 of Australian adults are overweight or obese, and close to 1/3 of kids are overweight or obese, and I suspect again that there's a similar situation in New Zealand, then the dietary approach that we've taken is wrong. And there's no doubt, you know, people often say to me, oh, well, you know, we're not following the dietary guidelines. Yes, we are following the dietary guidelines. For the last 40 years, our consumption of red meat and dairy has dropped. Our consumption of vegetables and grains has increased. And, you know, and particularly when the guidelines is being used to advise people with metabolic disease, such as pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and the Diabetes Association, which is our peak body here in Australia for diabetes, are recommending that people with diabetes eat by the Australian Dietary Guidelines. The Royal Australian College of GPs handbook for management of type 2 diabetes recommends eating by the dietary guidelines. However, the dietary guidelines actually, they themselves say that they're not intended for people with metabolic disorders. They're intended for people with who are healthy.
So it's diabetes guidelines over here.
Well, this is the thing, we you know, to be feeding people who have a carbohydrate intolerance,
absolutely,
high carbohydrate diet is absolutely the worst thing that we can be doing for them. So we need guidelines for people with metabolic disorder. And if we're calling the current manifestation of the Australian Dietary Guidelines to be used for healthy people, but when over 2/3 of us are not healthy, then it's completely wrong.
Well, I think RDI for carbohydrates is something like 120 grams per day, which equates out to, say, 30 to 40 grams per meal, which is basically what we can cope with our first phase insulin response without triggering that, you know, that big insulin second phase spike and starting to trigger insulin resistance. But of course, people are eating closer to, you know, 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day. So they're eating, you know, closer to sort of 250 and 300 grams per day. You want to just talk briefly about glucose intolerance and how there's kind of a genetic individual component to that and the insulin response, because that might help people kind of understand why some people seem to be able to eat a lot more carbohydrates and other people can't.
It's not really my area, but I'm happy to chat about to a degree. So basically, you know, if we look at sugar, for example, and the common table sugar sucrose, which is probably one of the commonest additives to our foods, what we stir in our tea and coffee, it's made up of 50% fructose and 50% glucose. So when that's absorbed into the bloodstream, it triggers the release of insulin, and insulin then helps move the glucose into every cell of our body, where it's either stored or used as an energy source. But when we have prolonged and excessive intake of glucose, essentially the cell becomes full of the glucose. The insulin level then rises to help try and push more glucose into the cell, but it reaches a stage where we can't actually get any more glucose into the cell, and that's where we become insulin resistant. And so then there's an overflow of glucose back into the bloodstream, taken up by the liver, converted into glycogen. The glycogen stores are limited, and so when the glycogen stores are limited, the liver starts turning the glucose into fat, which is actually exported away from the liver. But when the intake, or so I would say when the production of fat by the liver outstrips its ability to be exported away, the liver then starts taking on that fat, and we develop what's called a fatty liver. And a fatty liver is really quite instrumental to this whole process of type 2 diabetes. We also see fat accumulating in the pancreas, and it's this combination. It's actually quite a complex metabolic process. Without going into great detail, we see type 2 diabetes developing on average about 13 years after insulin resistance and a fatty liver develops in adults. In kids, it actually can develop within a couple of years. Yeah. And so this is that's why we're seeing type 2 diabetes in some young kids these days. So that's the glucose element. Now the fructose, which is the other 50% of sugar, that's not recognized as a food by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. It actually also suppresses our appetite control. When it's taken into the bloodstream, 100% is taken up by the liver, and about 30%, I believe, is converted immediately into fat. So it's actually far more toxic than glucose and giving rise to a fatty liver and type 2 diabetes. And, interestingly, when we are insulin resistant, even the glucose from the starch in the refined carbohydrates is converted into fructose. So, you have this double whammy then, if you're consuming carbohydrates and sugar, particularly the refined carbohydrates, this double whammy of fructose, glucose, really setting you up for type 2 diabetes. And if we throw into the mix seed oils, the vegetable oils, they're inflammatory, and I think ultimately they contribute to many of the complications of type 2 diabetes. So you have several elements working here, I think all in parallel. We have the high blood glucose level, which can be damaging to blood vessels in themselves. You have the high triglyceride level in the blood. So what happens when we develop a fatty liver? Eventually the fat stores within the liver become saturated, and then the liver exports that fat away as triglyceride, and that triglyceride combined with the high insulin level really drives the formation of fatty plaques, which then block the blood vessels throughout the body, and that in turn is what gives rise to the very serious complications of this disease. And if we then add in the seed oils, that will probably have a contribution to exacerbating the damage to the blood vessels. So yeah, it's a perfect storm of metabolic disease.
And it's interesting because we see, I do some work with some diabetes groups, and, you see them chugging down their orange juice and their fruit. Oh, lost you briefly. Okay, so welcome back after our little disruption there. We were just talking about, things like fructose and the lack of awareness around what are in some of the foods that we're consuming. And I was just talking about how with some of the diabetes groups I work with, they really believe that by drinking orange juice and eating lots of fruit, they're doing a lot to help themselves and they're being healthy, whereas in actual fact, they're really contributing towards fatty liver and prolonging the diabetes problem.
That's right, and particularly when people realize, or if they did realize, that a glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of soft drink. So it's a problem. And yes, I look at these things in terms of fruit. We're tending to eat more the low sugar fruits, so the berries, the apples, pears, things like that, rather than the high sugar fruits, such as the tropical fruits. And you're actually better off eating an orange, even 2 oranges, if you have to, rather than having the juice of 4, 5, 6 oranges to make up a glass of orange juice. So by having the juice, you're having the sugar without the fiber, which is important to slow down the digestion of the sugar from fruit.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit more about the diagnosis of diabetes, because you pointed out that, eye checks are really important, and you can tell a lot from, and do a lot of preventative work with eye checks. But even before that, like you said, it takes an average of 13 years to develop diabetes. And, I really feel we should be picking it up a lot earlier with regular GP visits and blood testing. In New Zealand, GPs tend to do HbA1c, and I have so many clients who are pre-diabetic or diabetic who their HbA1c is well within the normal ranges because they have that very high insulin always controlling it. And then once they are diagnosed as a diabetic, they're on metformin, and quite often they're on insulin. And then once again, they're told balance your carbs with your insulin. So if your blood sugars go up, take more insulin, and that will control your blood sugars, makes the HbA1c look better, but all this inflammatory cascade, all this damage is going on inside of the body that we can't see.
That's right. And in fact, the raised blood sugar level is just a symptom of type 2 diabetes, and it is the thing that most GPs really treat. But the big driver, as I mentioned before, is the high insulin level. That is the big driver of many of the complications. And the insulin level in people who are insulin resistant will be raised before the blood glucose is high. So in fact, what we should be doing is not measuring blood glucose to screen for patients with possible pre-diabetes or early type 2 diabetes, is actually look at blood insulin level. And if you want to be really, really clever about it, is to do ultrasound of the liver. But of course, radiological assessment and ultrasound of the liver is a much more, I suppose, expensive consuming test than just doing a quick blood test. But I believe, just measuring blood insulin is much more expensive than measuring blood sugar. But I think ultimately, if we want to pick up this disease earlier, if we want to prevent it, stop people going from pre-diabetes or insulin resistance to pre-diabetes to type 2 diabetes, then this would actually be a good thing to do, I believe.
And I think that if you look at your blood sugar, so for people listening, if they look at their blood sugar, their insulin and their triglycerides, and if you do a fasting test, 12 to 14 hours fasting, that gives you a very good indication that you could be pre-diabetic, or you are pre-diabetic, especially if you've got high blood pressure and, some other symptoms as well. If you're accumulating fat around your waist area, or if you're really struggling to lose weight. And in those situations, then basically you have exceeded your personal ability to tolerate the carbohydrates in your diet. And so you need to reduce them down to a level where you individually, with your genetic, can actually manage them.
Yes, that's right. In fact, that's called metabolic syndrome, which is really the crux of this problem. And metabolic syndrome is high blood sugar level, the high triglyceride level, a low HDL blood level, combined with hypertension, high blood pressure, and abdominal obesity. So one easy test that people can do is measure their abdominal girth, and it should be less than half of your height. And if it's not, then you most likely do have abdominal obesity, which means that you could have a fatty liver, fatty pancreas. You might be insulin resistant, pre-diabetic, or type 2 diabetic. So it's it's just a quick, easy measure that you can do. And if you do have abdominal obesity, then I'd be certainly encouraging your GP to not just measure your blood sugar, but your blood insulin level, even consider doing an ultrasound of the liver looking for a fatty liver. But as you say, what's interesting, actually, I find this very interesting, in the United States, and I suspect here in Australia, there are actually more thin metabolically unhealthy people than there are overweight or obese metabolically unhealthy people. So it's the obesity of itself is a marker for poor metabolic health. It's not the obesity of itself that's causing the type 2 diabetes. It's actually not even the number of calories, but it's the type of calories, and it's particularly those sugar and particularly the fructose, which is a very toxic element. And I suspect, yes, there are genetic variations. So some people can, if you can get a range of people all eating identical meals, and some people put on weight more easily. So there must be a genetic element to this as well.
And I think the Asian populations have a different range, don't they? Because they tend to be, that thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and so they look really healthy. They don't, they don't look like they've got any problems, but they're metabolically unhealthy inside.
That's right. That's right. And the Indian population, the Chinese population, and Pakistan as well, I think, are classically, with type 2 diabetes, they're actually thin. And there are other nations such as Micronesia, I think Iceland as well, some other nations who sometimes have a tendency to be overweight or obese, but develop diabetes. So there are variations amongst peoples and within different racial groups that can have an influence on this. But I think something like one, for people who are overweight or obese, but particularly people who are obese, only 1 out of every 200 will be metabolically healthy. So it's really a sign that you're not metabolically well and that you really should consider doing something to reverse it. And if we're saying that a significant driver to this poor metabolic health is our excessive consumption of sugar, carbs, ultra-processed foods, quite simply, reducing those is important. We talked before about orange juice and fruit. But for me, interestingly, so this time a year ago, I found out that I had a fatty liver. So that was a little confronting. I don't know if you can see me very well, but I'm tall and thin. I was about 6'4", and I never once considered myself overweight. I had a little tummy, which I wasn't that proud of, but when I found out a year ago I had a fatty liver, I just thought, wow, I better do something about this. And so I went into a sugar detox. And for me, I think there's lots of different ways you can approach it. And there's lots of books and apps and things to help you through this whole process, and websites and platforms and all sorts of things. But for me, just simply giving up the heavily sugared products. So my favorite thing was ice cream. So reducing my intake of ice cream. I used to have a bowl of ice cream every night, a big bowl, reducing my confectionery and chocolate, biscuits and cake, soft drinks and certainly fruit juices, and cutting back on pasta, white bread, white potatoes. I'm a foodie, I love food, and I still like having rice, bread, potato dishes, but I'm just not having them at the same degree I was before. And when I'm having pasta, we tend to use wholemeal pasta or go for brown rice or go for whole grain bread rather than pure white bread. So just making these modifications. And for me, I lost about 10 kilograms in 2 months. It just dropped off me. It was quite extraordinary. And I've got to go back and have my liver ultrasound again and see if I've reversed my fatty. But I was certainly on the path of certainly pre-diabetes. I didn't have pre-diabetes, but I'm sure I was on the pathway if I didn't make a change there. So, then you can go much more hard line. If I was pre-diabetic or if I did have type 2 diabetes, I'd go harder line on my dietary approach. I'd really be looking, at a low carb, even ketogenic sort of diet to really reverse that metabolic situation that you've created in your body.
Mm. So what did you replace those foods with? Did you just reduce your calorie consumption altogether, or did you increase, your good fats in your diet, or did you maintain your protein amount? As you know, I'm a real hot on the protein kind of girl.
Yes, the protein and protein leverage is really important in all this process. I think if you look at those ultra-processed foods that I was consuming, in excess, no doubt about it, because I think a lifetime of doing that, I've created this fatty liver. Then they're not foods, they're hyperpalatable foods, they're foods that don't add anything, they don't add anything to satiety or to making you feel satisfied with your meals. And as I mentioned before, the fructose component suppresses your appetite control. And again, this is a complex hormonal process, but you don't really need to replace them with anything. I mean, I replace my soft drinks and fruit juice with water. I drink a lot of water these days. I haven't had a soft drink for a year or two, I would have thought. So you don't really necessarily need to replace them. So I do enjoy a dessert, and what I've been having these days is just some strawberries, it's beautiful raspberries and blackberries and things around at the moment. So we have a bowl of berries after dinner rather than the bowl of ice cream. We're tending to have a 70% plus dark chocolate rather than that sweetened milk chocolate that I used to consume a lot of. So doing things like that is really, really important. And I think making sure...
It's not about depriving yourself, is it?
Sorry, depriving yourself of those sugary products,
depriving yourself of nice food, and because I think there's a real struggle for people to actually give them up, and they look for something to replace them with.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many things you can replace them with, and there are things which make you feel satisfied. Those hyperpalatable ultra processed foods that you can just, anyone will know once they've opened a packet of crisps, of chips, it's hard to stop until you finish the packet. If you've opened a block of chocolate, it's hard to stop. If you've opened a bucket of ice cream, it's hard to stop. And I know if I have ice cream in the freezer here, then it's not safe until it's gone. And so I say to my wife, please just don't have it in the house, because it's such a powerful draw, that drawer of these sorts of foods. So, I think the other thing, if you are actually consuming nutrient-dense foods and foods with healthy fats and foods with protein, means that you're satisfied sooner. So you can eat to satiety. And then because you're satisfied, you're not snacking between meals. And I think the snacking between meals is a dangerous thing to do. So if you have a meal, or whatever it might be, which has a good amount of healthy fat and protein in it, and minimize your carbs, then you're able to get through to the next meal without having to snack and look for things. And so it's a really important thing to do. I actually incorporate a 16/8 fast, so I don't eat anything after dinner through till lunchtime the next day. And for a week or so was I'd be a bit hungry, but now it's just part of what I do, and it's not a problem whatsoever. And by the time I have lunch, I'm really looking forward to lunch, and I have a lunch which gets me through till dinner, and I don't find it a problem. And we have fabulous variety in the food we eat. There's so much fabulous nutrient-dense food out there that you're not depriving yourself by not having chips, ice cream, chocolate, and some of these ultra-processed foods, which are sold as being healthy, but they're truly not healthy, many of them.
And I think we've been brought up, through my whole nutrition training, we were taught, you must have glucose. The brain needs glucose. The red blood cells need glucose. And that's absolutely true. They do. But they don't need to eat glucose. We make it ourselves. And so in your 16 hours of fasting, your body is using your body fat and your amino acids to make glucose to keep you fed and healthy. And then you don't feel hungry. You have that feeling of satiety, for a longer period of time.
That's right. There's no biochemical process in the body, and this is second year science, second year medicine for me. There's no biochemical process that demands that we ingest sugar and refined carbohydrates. As you say, we can get all of the glucose from the fats and proteins that we eat. So this is another really important thing for people to be aware of. And there's a few things that I think that many people kind of inherently know, or believe at least, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Well, that was a phrase coined by John Harvey Kellogg to market his brand new invented breakfast cereal, Kellogg's Cornflakes, 100 or so years ago. But there's no evidence to say that we have to have breakfast. There's absolutely no evidence that this is...
Well, he had me convinced for many, many years. I used to tell all my clients, you've got to eat breakfast,
Yeah, but this is a myth, and this has been going on for 100 years, and this is just something we know. And the other thing that we kind of know is that saturated fats are bad for us. Red meat's bad, eggs are demonized, butter, all of these things which have been vilified for so long. There's actually no evidence to say it or to prove it. And so it's these are such basic but absolutely critical elements to our health that people need to be aware of. And I'm, since really over the last year, I've been more conscious of what I'm eating, as I mentioned before, just avoiding those heavily sugared products and minimizing refined carbs and ultra processed foods, but actually now going back to some of the healthy fats. So rather than margarine, which is a chemistry experiment, rather than margarine on a bit of whole grain bread, I'll go back to butter, and I cook with butter more, and eating and enjoying more eggs, because I realize that they're actually critical to our health. These natural saturated fats are absolutely vital to our survival.
And they also have so many other good qualities and good nutrients in them that are really essential for our brain health and our, cellular health and our hormonal health. So, yeah, I think we've sort of thrown a lot of things out with this false hypothesis about saturated fat, and that's led us on to vilifying protein. I feel like both the high carb and the low carb proponents to some extent vilify protein, you know, and that protein's now the, you know, especially from red meat, is now the bad guy, and we should be keeping our protein low. And there's absolutely no evidence for it. In fact, more recent evidence is that we need more protein, particularly as we age, and that protein from red meat is far superior to the protein from plant sources, you know, in terms of the quality of the amino acids, in terms of the metabolic triggers they provide.
Absorbability.
Yeah, absorbability, but also those plant proteins come with so many calories. So getting 2 or 3 times the number of calories. So
get the same amount of protein, absolutely.
Get the amount of protein, yeah.
Exactly, where you have you know, the 3 of the most nutrient dense foods that we can eat are red meat, and I'm not mad on offal, and I don't like liver, but I understand liver is absolutely fabulous in terms of nutrition and nutrient, very, very nutrient dense. The other thing is salmon and oysters. I found out the other day are fabulous for you as well. They're full of goodies. So you know, there's no need. You know, if you, for whatever reason, you don't like red meat, you know, go for oysters and go for salmon. You can't go wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just to sort of finish up and ask the last few questions, if somebody goes along to their GP and they are concerned about, you know, well, they want their insulin tested and they're sort of a little bit concerned about being pre-diabetic or diabetic, how would you advise them? How would you advise them to talk to their GP and, you know, be able to deal with, you know, this sort of complex issues, rather than just be told, look, your blood tests are fine, your cholesterol's a bit high, we'll give you a statin, you know. And I listened to you in the beginning and my heart really went out to the pressure and what our doctors go through. And I have the absolute most highest respect for doctors, you know, but when it comes to nutrition, you know, sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge. And yeah, if you've got any advice for people, that would be great.
Yeah, it's hard because as doctors in medical school, when I went through medical school, there was no nutrition that we were exposed to. My son has just finished 2nd year medicine. He did nutrition as an elective, but that was just as an elective. He could have chosen something else, but he chose it because of what I was talking about this year. He thought he'd quite like to get a bit deeper understanding as well. So really, doctors aren't well versed in nutrition, and particularly when, as I mentioned before, our poor diet is such a driver of our chronic disease disaster that we're currently in at the moment, then I think it behoves doctors to learn about this. I think in medical school, it needs to be addressed, and that this is a critical element to our health going forward. So this is all going to take time, but I think these are important things that need to be done. Also, there are many doctors who possibly not aware of, as I mentioned before, the reversibility of type 2 diabetes. They probably still of the understanding or of the thinking that natural saturated fats are bad for us. But there is now a growing group of general practitioners, endocrinologists, medical specialists such as myself, who are a bit more peripheral but dealing with the complications of type 2 diabetes, nutritionists such as yourself, dietitians, exercise physiologists who understand that the current trajectory that we're on with our poor metabolic health and the diet that's underlying it needs to change. And we're seeing this groundswell of people now and who are understanding that that a high carb approach is not right, and there's no evidence whatsoever to say that high carb actually prevents or reverses type 2 diabetes. But we now have over 100 controlled clinical trials that shows that a dietary approach, but particularly a low carbohydrate dietary approach, can actually prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes. We keep on seeing papers all the time being published that support this. And so we're seeing, I think if your GP, I mean, you know, it's not for me to say if your GP doesn't believe in a low carb approach, go to another GP, but I certainly, if that was me, and my GP was poo-pooing it when there's such strong evidence. And we're seeing stories, people are telling stories on social media all the time about how they've been able to reverse their type 2 diabetes. Very heartwarming stories of success with this. And so I'd be trying to find, and particularly if I had a metabolic disease such as type 2 diabetes, I would be wanting to find a combination of a general practitioner, endocrinologist, and a dietitian or nutritionist that really understands this deeply. And there are a number of websites that people can tap into. There are also websites such as Low Carb Down Under, where they can actually find within their city, within their state, practitioners that believe and practice this method and are actually getting amazing results. And I think we'll see this growing over the coming years. I was part of the expert advisory group for the National Diabetes Strategy in Australia over the last year, and I managed to have the ability or the opportunity to put type 2 diabetes into remission now into that strategy. So that's an exciting moment. And then once we've got that in place in our National Diabetes Strategy, then other things will continue to flow on from that. And also if we actually are able to reverse the advice in the dietary guidelines to one that doesn't discourage natural saturated fats and one that has been encouraging the harmful seed oils, if we can reverse some of those things, then we'll start to see this, the chronic disease, which are diet related, start to plateau off and hopefully drop in the coming 10 to 20 years.
Well, I've certainly seen an acceleration over the last 10 or 12 years of professionals like yourself coming on board, so now it's not just crazy people like me. There's a whole lot of, far better educated, real expert opinions out there now promoting this. And I think the more that voices like yours can be heard all around the world, but especially in Australia and New Zealand, the better. Because we do need to give credibility to the concepts as well, not just I think that's really important. There needs to be some credibility behind these concepts for other doctors to take on board, So fingers crossed.
Absolutely, and far from me being an ophthalmologist and telling people with diabetes or practitioners how to manage patients with type 2 diabetes, but I have lived this for the last year. I've immersed myself in this space, and I have quite a good understanding and believe I have I'm basing my thoughts on solid scientific evidence. Often the evidence in this space is a little bit shaky, but I think the more doctors and dietary practitioners start to understand and realize it's all about the biochemistry. What happens inside of the body is all about the biochemistry. What happens outside the body is all about profits and ideology and vested interests. And so I think we need to come back and focus on the fact that this is about biochemistry.
And like you said, this was second year biochemistry for you in your medical training, all the Krebs cycle and gluconeogenesis and insulin and, you probably did it and then forgot it and got on to more exciting things like fixing people's cataracts.
That's right. Yeah, it's so important. And this is, when did I do second year medical school? It was back in 1983, I think it was. I mean, it's nearly 40 years ago. That was well known then, and we seem to have forgotten it as doctors. And a lot of this has been based on, we come back to the conflicts of interest and vested interests, the creation of the American Dietary Guidelines 40 years ago, which was really the first of that demonization of natural saturated fats, which then swept all over the world. But that was based on scientific thought.
Well, epidemiology too, which is what underpins most of our dietary.
Weak evidence.
Yeah, and it's such weak evidence, and everyone knows it's weak evidence, but we just keep on using it, which is so frustrating.
Exactly. Well, I've applied to be on the review committee for the dietary guideline review coming up. Whether or not they'll invite me to be on it, or it's yet to be seen? But
Well, I've got my fingers crossed, and I'd like to propose you to be on the New Zealand Review Committee as well. That would be something pretty special.
well, at least you should be on it, Susan.
A couple more questions, and then I'll let you go. Thank you so much. So just one more about diabetes and health, because the reason I've really got so passionate about this is because of the kids in our country. And we had our first type 2 diabetic child in 1994, and we're increasing between 3 to 5% per annum. And it just absolutely breaks my heart. The loss of potential, the loss of youth, just, you know, so many factors. It's just not fair on kids to be dealing with this. What would be a take-home message for mums and dads and whānau and grandparents and the bigger family? What would be a take-home message about our kids, and how do we stop this?
It's really, the whole thing has to be a systemic change. I'd love to give you a take-home message, and I'll try and distill it down into a take-home message. But if we go back to my 5 A's of sugar toxicity, and I said there were 3 overarching A's, which was awareness. So we talked about that earlier. Accountability. So accountability of businesses and industry to do the right thing by people, and ultimately action of our government, or our governments of New Zealand and Australia, to raise awareness about the toxic impact of sugar and the issues surrounding type 2 diabetes, and to hold accountable the predatory sales and marketing tactics of the business and industry, which is rife and just appalling. And there are so many examples that we can give you, but quite literally, I mentioned before about checking out from supermarkets, and you've got half-price chocolates there, and you've got a kid in tow. It's impossible to pass that barrier without having bought them a treat. And so I've been lobbying, and I've been writing to all the major supermarket chains and stores to remove the sugary products from those checkout counters. Another thing would be to remove the ads for sugary products from social media and from TV commercials, which are specifically aimed at kids. Because one thing is for a parent to say, no, we're not going to have ice cream, chocolates, soft drinks in the house. But then they go to the shop, or there's a vending machine at school or at university, or there's ads on TV which are constantly reminding them about these things. We need to protect the environment of people, and if we particularly say that sugar is an addictive product, then you need to protect the environment of someone who is addicted or physically dependent on an addictive substance. So this is really important. So we can't just have one of these things as a standalone. The other thing is putting a levy on sugary products to reduce their consumption and purchase. So all of these things kind of need to happen in parallel, because if you don't, then it can easily fall over. But I think in terms of raising awareness amongst our kids, we need a solid schools education program. There is an education program about type 1 diabetes, but we need a solid schools education program about type 2 diabetes and how unhealthy eating is giving rise to it, and to really open the eyes of children, excuse the pun, about all of the various elements that surround this. And then that's one thing, but I mean, parents need to be educated as well. So we need to see that awareness raising on free-to-air TV and across social media. So the take-home message would be that if you can minimize these sugary products, but when I say sugar, I'm also throwing in that the refined carbohydrates and the ultra-processed foods, which are often packed with sugar and refined carbohydrates, just minimize in your house. I remember back when I was growing up, on a Friday at the end of the day, Dad would bring home, I think they were called summer rolls. They were like muesli bars or something that we would sit around TV and have a muesli bar each. But that was our treat for the week. But now we just have access. We have all these things in the house all the time. I think just remove those heavily sugared products. Be aware of which stuff has excessive amounts of sugar in it. And also be aware, it's really hard when you look at the nutritional labels on foodstuffs. Be aware that when it says sugar, also when there's carbohydrates there, then quite often that is sugar as well, but also the 56 common names for sugar, which don't include the word sugar. So there's so many tricks that the industry plays on us, and just educate yourselves about what we're doing now with our diet, and try and reverse that in the house. And the more we do that, the more our kids understand, then I think we will move into a better place here.
I know, you know, I'm tempted, and I fall into the trap myself with my grandkids or my young nephews, and it's like, oh, I'll give you, you know, we're going to have an ice cream for a treat, or where's, you know, for them to go take them to the park and play, or go and build some huts somewhere, or go and do something where I'm giving them my time and my attention, would be a much more valuable treat, probably in both directions, really. But, you know, it's just so easy to say, oh, you kids have been really good, or, you know, let's go and have an ice cream.
Yeah.
It's just rethinking those things, you know?
It is rethinking those things. You're absolutely right. And rather than using sugary products as a treat, when you would, let's say, go to the movies, for example, and you might get an ice cream or a soft drink to go to the movies with, or a pack of lollies, you know, don't, you know, break those habits of actually trying to go to a movie with a sweet treat. Just even calling sweets a treat, you know, is a habit as well, I think. So, yeah. There's so many things. It's huge, but I think just being aware of the sugary products in our environment and just minimizing, I reckon would actually, you know, would reduce a huge amount of chronic disease if we just simply did that. Eating real food, you know, eating real food, something that doesn't come in a package, something that doesn't have a label, something that doesn't have more than 5 ingredients. You know, you can't go wrong if you eat real food for the most part.
One of the really frustrating aspects of this, I find, is talking to people, is it's always someone else's problem. You know, we talk about, you know, the obesity epidemic or the diabetes epidemic, and they're like, oh yeah, you know, it's absolutely shocking, you know, we need to do something about it. Like, it's not them. And, you know, and it's such a hard one, like getting people to actually own the problem. But that's probably a whole nother topic that we can talk about.
Yeah, and it's, you know, when you discover, and like I discovered that I had a fatty liver, you think, oh my goodness, you know, I'm not healthy, and it's often until you get that wake up call that it's like smokers, they have the heart attack and then I'll give up cigarettes, but actually, you know, cigarettes is one thing, and it took us decades to reverse the whole cigarette problem. But this is much bigger and deeper and conflicted than cigarettes, because it involves so many different industries. It involves jobs, it involves revenue for governments, it involves votes, and often in marginal seats. And so it's a complex issue for governments as well. So it's not one we're going to solve. I was hoping to have solved it in my year as Australian of the Year, but unfortunately, I like, as I said before, I like having a project and completing a project. So I feel a little frustrated, and you know, whether I continue on this pathway, we'll see.
Well, that was going to be my last question to you, because you've obviously done some really amazing, incredible things in your life, and you've had a fabulous life, and you've made a huge contribution to society. What keeps you grounded? Is there anything you do? What keeps you focused? What helps you be able to tolerate the stress and because I'm sure that it's not always easy. And, you know, we talked yesterday very briefly about the frustrations of, you know, trying to deal with colleagues and other people in the space. And yeah, so just sort of what keeps you going, and how do you manage all that stuff?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a positive person. I'm probably naturally a positive person, but there are ways of improving your positivity or moving yourself into a more positive mindset. And through some of those confronting experiences I mentioned to you before, I thought about this quite a bit, and how one ultimately builds more resilience in your life. This is what this is all about, isn't it? And you know, this time last year, or let's say early last year, when the pandemic broke out, and I had this fabulous opportunity as Australian of the Year, and it just literally all dissolved before my eyes in March, and I had basically speaking engagements and fabulous opportunities booked throughout the year in that first 3 or 4 weeks of receiving the award, and then they all just went. And so I was pretty dejected, thinking this is such a shame, because I have this valuable opportunity and it's all pretty much gone. So what I did was, and there was definitely an element of stress that I had. When you're faced with a stressful situation, when you're faced with an unexpected change, and the coronavirus pandemic is a fantastic example of it. Suddenly we had this unexpected change in our life, and this is when you need to draw on your inner strength or resilience. And to me, there are ways of forging a more resilient persona, I suppose. And the first is quite simply just keeping a cool head. So when you're faced with a sudden, unexpected adversity, let's say, you can go to pieces, or we can just take some deep breaths. And once you get a cool head, then you can start to say to yourself, okay, I'm going to get through this. And when you are saying to yourself, I'm going to get through this, you're already moving into a more positive headspace, right? And when you're feeling more positive, you can say, well, I'm going to get through it. Well, how am I going to get through it? Well, I'm going to get through it because I'm going to solve these challenges and innovate. And so to me, keeping a cool head, having a positive approach, and innovation are the 3 key elements to being resilient and to dealing with these times. And so what I did early in the year, and I think the central part of this is the positive mindset. And there are ways of building a positive mindset, and just briefly, having good health. When you're suddenly faced with a calamity, you can't suddenly have good health. So we need to eat well and exercise. That's important. Getting a good night's sleep. We know we're not as resilient. We're not cope as well with things when we haven't had a good night's sleep. Surround yourself with good friends. So rather than people who are trying to pull you down, you want to surround yourself with other positive people who are uplifting and give you that positive energy. And the other thing is good habits. And just looking at habits, you can take on bad habits when you're stressed, and we all know those. Alcohol, cigarette smoking, illicit drugs, eating too much sugary food and ultra-processed food. These all trigger the release of feel-good chemicals such as dopamine, which counters that cortisol reaction. But rather than doing that, you can actually take good habits, and there are a number of good habits. I'm sure you can think of many. Going for a walk somewhere beautiful in nature, listening to your favorite music, reaching out to someone else who's having a tough time and do a good deed. These have all been shown to be as effective as sugar in countering that stress reaction in the body.
Protein.
And there you go. There's something. And also just reinforcing the positivity. So what I do every morning before I leap out of bed is, what 3 things have I got to look forward to today, or 3 or more things? And at the end of the day, what 3 things have happened during the day that I can be grateful for, that I really enjoyed? And, early last year when I was feeling stressed, I'd go for a walk up in the Adelaide Hills. So getting out into nature where it's beautiful, I get to the top of the hill, look down over the, it was often early in the morning before the sun had broken, looking out over the lights, and just think of 3 things that I had to look forward to during the day. And I must say, I moved pretty quickly from being dejected into a much more positive space. I hardly ever felt more positive. And I was able to then say, all these opportunities that I had, okay, how am I going to change this? Well, I'm going to create these online opportunities. And so I started creating online keynotes, which I then started delivering, and really was able to ultimately, I think, have more impact this year than I might have otherwise done. So I think a good outcome.
Yeah, I really love that. I think that's a great way to finish up here. But yes, I think you've probably managed to broaden your impact, by taking that approach, and touch a lot more people than if you were just in a single conference, to be honest.
I hope so, and we'll see. Time to hand over the baton this weekend, but I'm looking forward to having a rest, sleeping a bit better, and coming back to my family.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been just amazing talking to you, and I'm so thrilled with the work you're doing and the contribution, and coming and talking to all us all us Kiwis over here about what you've been doing. It's really appreciated.